They told you that life was meant to be a constant uphill climb, filled with endless bills, sacrifices, and sleepless nights of worry. And what if I tell you that this very struggle you've been taught to embrace is not the proof of your strength, but the chain that keeps you locked in a cycle of scarcity? You were conditioned to see poverty not as a temporary circumstance, but as a natural state of existence, almost like air you must breathe to prove your resilience. Every story you've heard, every whispered lesson at the dinner table, every warning about money being dangerous has been woven into your subconscious like an unbreakable thread. The struggle became your identity, the way you measure your worth, the silent badge of honor you never asked to wear but can't seem to remove. And as you push harder, working twice as much for half as little, the world quietly feeds you the illusion that suffering is noble, while abundance is suspicious. Deep down, though, there is a nagging sense that maybe you've been deceived, that the comfort you find in chaos is not freedom, but addiction disguised as survival. You notice how drama seems to follow you, how even when relief is within reach, you unconsciously sabotage it just to return to familiar ground. The adrenaline of financial storms, the nervous anticipation of not knowing how you'll make it through the month, strangely fuels you like a hidden drug you didn't know you were taking. But what happens when the storm is gone? When there is no fire to put out, no emergency to solve? Do you notice how uneasy the calm feels? That is the poverty state. Not just empty pockets, but a restless mind that thrives on crisis. And the more you normalize it, the more it becomes your reality. As if the universe is simply following the script you've been reciting. This script, however, was never truly yours. It was handed to you by generations who knew only struggle and lacked the tools to rewrite the narrative. And here's the twist. Once you see the script for what it is, you can decide to stop performing in the play entirely. But before you can step off that stage, you must first understand how the addiction to struggle seduces you, how it convinces you that without pain there can be no growth. That realization does not come easily, because the mind rebels against comfort when it has been trained to worship hardship. Yet the first crack in the illusion appears the moment you question whether every struggle you face is truly necessary or simply a habit disguised as destiny. And it is in that questioning that the door begins to open, revealing that struggle is not proof of life, but a pattern designed to keep you small. The question that lingers then is not whether you deserve abundance, but whether you're brave enough to step away from the chaos you've been told is your home. For as long as the storm feels safer than the calm, you'll keep calling the storm back. But there is another way, a path most overlook because it feels unnatural at first, yet it holds the key to freedom beyond survival. And that's where the journey begins, because the real enemy is not poverty itself, but the invisible grip of the poverty state on your imagination. As the veil starts to lift, you'll realize that what you've called normal has only ever been a cleverly designed prison dressed up as life. And once you see the bars, you can never unsee them, because the truth will always whisper that there's more waiting for you just beyond the struggle. Can you imagine waking up one morning and realizing that everything you believed about money, success, and worth was subtly rigged against you? Like a game you never agreed to play but have been competing in your whole life? Picture for a moment how liberating it would feel to see the patterns, the invisible strings pulling you back into struggle, no matter how hard you try to break free. You start noticing how every crisis, every financial panic, and every moment of scarcity has been quietly teaching your brain to seek drama rather than peace, to reward tension rather than calm. And suddenly, it clicks. The very stress that exhausted you also kept you distracted, kept you from imagining life beyond survival, kept you from claiming a reality that feels effortless. Now consider this. The fear of abundance is far more powerful than the fear of lack, because stepping into prosperity challenges every story you were taught about who you are and what you deserve. It's not just about money, it's about identity, and the identity that thrived on struggle resists change with silent, relentless force. You begin to notice how even opportunities for ease are met with hesitation, self-doubt, and a strange, almost guilty discomfort, Because your subconscious insists that comfort is dangerous, that wealth is a trap, that ease is somehow unearned. And yet the pull of possibility grows stronger as you observe the patterns, as you watch how the universe is always ready to give if only you can remove the blocks you've been nurturing for decades. Can you feel how electrifying it is to imagine that the prison walls were never real? That abundance has always been on the other side, waiting quietly for your awareness to catch up. And so, with every revelation, every aha moment, you inch closer to understanding that the struggle was never about proving your worth, but about keeping your imagination small. As the layers peel back, you start to see how your habits, your conversations, and even your relationships have been subtly reinforcing limitation, like loyal soldiers guarding an invisible kingdom of lack. You notice how some friends unknowingly celebrate hardship, how some family members glorify struggle, and how culture itself teaches that suffering is the badge of honor you must wear to be respected. Yet, despite all the conditioning, there is a flicker inside, a tiny defiance that whispers there must be another way, a life that does not revolve around scarcity or stress. That flicker grows as you explore, as you begin to test new thoughts, new beliefs, new assumptions about what is possible, and you feel a mixture of fear and exhilaration. The brain resists, yes, but every experiment in possibility chips away at the old architecture of limitation, revealing the hidden corridors where ease and abundance can flow freely. You realize that the struggle was never necessary for growth, that every hardship was amplified by a mind trained to expect it, and that liberation lies in re-educating yourself to expect something entirely different. And even as doubts surface, even as old fears claw their way back, the vision of a life lived without constant tension begins to feel real, tangible, magnetic. You start to see that the key is not working harder, but thinking differently, feeling differently, imagining differently. Because the outer world always mirrors the inner world. And with that understanding, the first true step toward breaking free from the poverty state is taken. Because now awareness has entered the equation. But that was only the beginning, because seeing the trap is one thing, and stepping boldly into a new reality is another, far more thrilling, challenge waiting just ahead. Now consider this. What if the very stories you've been telling yourself about struggle are like worn grooves on a record, repeating the same scarcity over and over until you believe it is inevitable, unchangeable, and sacred? Picture for a moment how deeply this repetition has shaped your emotions, your choices, and the small, unconscious compromises you make every single day. You notice how fear disguises itself as prudence, how hesitation masquerades as wisdom, and how procrastination is really your mind clinging to the safety of the familiar struggle. Can you feel the subtle thrill in chaos, the perverse comfort in knowing exactly how hardship will unfold, because it makes life predictable, even when it's painful? And as the veil lifts further, you begin to see that every bill that seems to arrive out of nowhere, every unexpected expense, every disappointment in work or relationships has been amplified by the mind trained to anticipate lack, rather than abundance. You start to understand that this isn't coincidence, but a carefully rehearsed script running in the background, directing your attention to struggle while blinding you to possibility. Picture how differently life would feel if the mind were trained to anticipate opportunity, to recognize synchronicity, and to expect wealth as a natural part of existence rather than a rare miracle. The realization stirs something inside you, a mixture of anger, curiosity, and hope, because suddenly the injustice of the invisible programming becomes undeniable. You reflect on the habits that keep you anchored, the self-limiting thoughts repeated silently, the complaints shared openly, the subtle envy of others who appear to live effortlessly, all reinforcing the old cycle. And yet, even as recognition hits, there is a sense of empowerment brewing, because awareness is the first crack in the foundation of the poverty state. Now the question becomes not why me, but how do I step out of the loop that feels like home? You sense that old comforts, the adrenaline, the drama, the survival rituals, will resist being released, almost like old friends who have overstayed their welcome. And the paradox emerges. You want freedom, but the mind fears the unfamiliar calm, because calm has no drama, no justification, no story to cling to. But as you observe this, you begin to notice opportunities that were invisible before. Subtle doors opening in the routines you once thought rigid and immovable. Can you imagine the thrill of testing a thought that promises abundance and seeing it ripple into reality, small at first, then bolder and bolder, until the old record is scratched beyond recognition? And the more you experiment, the more the invisible chains begin to loosen, revealing that the scarcity you have been chasing was never the enemy, but the illusion sustaining itself. You feel the magnetic pull of possibility, a quiet insistence that life can be different, richer, easier, and more expansive. And suddenly, the notion of struggle begins to feel optional, not mandatory, a habit that can be unlearned rather than a destiny written in stone. As the layers peel back, you start to see the hidden mechanics of limitation. Fear, repetition, identity, and expectation, all woven together in a tapestry that you can now begin to unravel. And that is when the journey takes on a new intensity, because seeing the trap is only part of the battle. The real transformation begins when you choose to step into uncharted freedom. Can you imagine standing at the edge of a life that feels limitless, yet sensing a strange pullback toward what you've always known, the familiar hum of struggle that has been your shadow for so long? Picture for a moment the nervous excitement coursing through you as you realize that abundance, ease, and creativity are not distant fantasies, but very real possibilities, waiting quietly for your permission to enter. And as you look closer, you notice how every obstacle you once feared, financial deadlines, relationship tensions, societal expectations, suddenly begins to feel like a mirror reflecting your inner beliefs rather than unmovable walls. Now consider this. The very tension you once believed was unavoidable was really a signal, a call to examine your assumptions and question what you've been told about life, money, and worth. You feel the thrill of possibility mingled with the resistance of old programming, like two currents pulling you in opposite directions, one toward ease and one toward habit. Can you sense how this resistance manifests subtly in procrastination, self-doubt, or even distraction, steering you back into the safety of struggle just when clarity begins to shine? And yet, with each observation, you grow stronger, because awareness is the first tangible step toward rewriting the story you've been living unconsciously. You notice patterns in your environment, in the language you hear and speak, in the assumptions of friends and family, all subtly reinforcing the idea that life is hard and that abundance must be earned through relentless toil. But you also notice small cracks, moments of insight, tiny shifts in perception where the possibility of ease feels not only real, but deserved. Picture how liberating it feels to experiment with these shifts, imagining outcomes that defy the script, testing the assumption that life can be effortless and surprisingly joyful. And as you take these mental steps, reality begins to respond in quiet ways, revealing opportunities that were invisible when your focus was trapped on lack. You realize that abundance is not just a reward, but a reflection, a mirror of the thoughts, feelings, and assumptions you carry within. Can you feel how exhilarating it is to recognize that every limitation was created, not by the world, but by your mind's adherence to old habits? And as this awareness deepens, you begin to sense a growing power, a reclaiming of choice, because you now understand that struggle is optional, not mandatory, and that a different life is always possible. You notice how your emotional reactions start to shift, how fear loses its grip, and how joy begins to seep in even before circumstances change. And suddenly, the old cycles of panic, self-sabotage, and desperation feel alien, as if you are witnessing someone else's life rather than your own. You start to imagine a future where creation, imagination, and freedom are the default states, and scarcity is simply a distant memory. And yet, even in this excitement, a quiet question lingers. Will you trust this new vision enough to let go of the familiar struggle entirely? Because stepping fully into abundance requires more than understanding. It requires courage, practice, and a willingness to rewrite the script of your life from the ground up. But as the currents of possibility grow stronger, you realize that the old patterns can no longer hold you. Because the mind, once awakened, cannot unsee the doors it has discovered. And that is when the journey truly intensifies, because seeing the potential is only the first step. Choosing it is where transformation begins. Now consider this. What if the very habits you've clung to for comfort, the late nights worrying, the endless comparison, the mental replay of past mistakes, are the invisible chains keeping you locked in the poverty state, convincing you that struggle is unavoidable? Picture for a moment how these habits quietly shape every decision, every reaction, every belief you hold about money, success, and even your own worth, as if they were threads woven into the very fabric of your identity. Can you feel how the mind defends these patterns, how it whispers doubts and fears the moment you imagine a different reality? Because familiarity, even painful familiarity, feels safer than the unknown. And as you watch this unfold, you start to notice how self-sabotage isn't random but deliberate in the unconscious sense, a way the mind preserves the old story, ensuring that nothing threatens the comfort of the struggle. Now consider this. Every fear you've ever had about abundance, fear of judgment, fear of responsibility, fear of standing out, is really just resistance wearing a mask, a subtle reminder that your comfort zone has been your prison disguised as home. You begin to see the paradox. The very drive that pushed you to survive, to hustle, and to endure was also the same force that taught you to mistrust ease and abundance. Picture how life could feel if you stopped viewing struggle as validation and began to treat it as a habit that can be replaced rather than a destiny that must be endured. And with this realization comes a strange mix of exhilaration and fear, because unlearning a lifelong pattern shakes the foundation of identity itself. You notice how the world around you starts to feel different when you begin questioning old assumptions, how opportunities appear in places you never expected, and how synchronicity seems to favor those willing to think differently. Can you imagine the thrill of testing a new thought, a new belief, and witnessing small shifts ripple through your reality, affirming that the poverty state was never external, but internal? And yet, even as you take these mental steps, old patterns tug at you, whispering that the comfort of struggle is the only life you know, that abundance is risky, and that ease is undeserved. You realize that breaking free requires more than knowledge. It demands consistent mental discipline, a rewiring of assumptions, and the courage to act as if abundance is already your natural state. And as the layers of conditioning peel back, you start to notice how much energy you were unconsciously dedicating to maintaining limitation rather than creating possibility. Now the challenge becomes choosing thoughts that empower rather than deplete, actions that elevate rather than reinforce fear, and a mindset that expects abundance rather than scarcity. Can you feel how intoxicating this freedom is? How it awakens a creative energy that had been dormant beneath the weight of worry? And as you embrace this, you begin to see that struggle was never noble. It was habitual, addictive, and entirely optional. Picture for a moment the liberation that comes from consciously stepping out of patterns that no longer serve you. And imagine how every area of life, relationships, career, finances, begins to respond differently when your inner state shifts. And with that, a new possibility emerges. A life not defined by scarcity, struggle, or fear, but by conscious creation, imagination, and the quiet power of choice. But that was only the beginning, because awareness is just the spark, and the real transformation comes as you fully claim the freedom your mind has been craving all along. Can you imagine the brain itself being wired to seek struggle? How every spike of stress and anxiety releases a hidden reward that keeps you unconsciously addicted to chaos, like a silent chemical loop reinforcing limitation? Picture for a moment how every late-night worry, every urgent problem, and every financial panic has been training your nervous system to expect scarcity as normal, even comforting, because tension produces a subtle rush that feels oddly familiar. Now consider this. The very highs and lows of struggle are like a secret drug, providing fleeting bursts of excitement and energy that the mind mistakes for life, even when life could feel calm, secure, and abundant. You notice how your body tightens when money conversations arise, how your chest constricts when opportunity appears, as if the mind instinctively resists peace in favor of the adrenaline it knows. Can you sense the paradox? The same mind that craves freedom also clings desperately to what it perceives as safe, because the familiar rhythm of struggle has been coded as security. And yet, as you become aware of this hidden addiction, You begin to recognize the subtle patterns of self-sabotage that emerge every time abundance draws near. Picture the countless moments when opportunity was just within reach, yet hesitation, doubt, or distraction silently nudged you back toward the familiar storm. And as this awareness deepens, you start to see how emotional dependency on struggle has been reinforced by every story you've absorbed, every example of hardship glorified by culture, family, and society. Now consider this. The adrenaline, the drama, the tension, once your fuel, is not a sign of strength, but a signal that your system has been conditioned to resist calm and prosperity. Can you imagine how different life would feel if the mind could release that chemical addiction? If you could retrain your nervous system to anticipate ease, stability, and abundance with the same intensity it once craved struggle? And as you test this, small shifts emerge, moments of serenity, unshakable clarity, a sense of possibility replacing panic that begin to convince the mind that calm can be as thrilling as chaos. You notice how even subtle adjustments in thought, like imagining success or feeling gratitude, begin to reroute the brain's habitual responses, rewiring your emotional circuits toward abundance. Picture the liberation in knowing that the tension you once mistook for life was just a pattern, and that you have the power to choose a different rhythm entirely. And as you embrace this new awareness, the invisible chains of struggle begin to loosen, revealing that scarcity was never fixed. It was programmed, habitual, and reversible. Now you see why people cling to difficulty, why comfort feels alien, and why peace can feel like danger. Because the brain has been chemically trained to resist it. And the exciting part is this: once you recognize the addiction, you can consciously override it, slowly but steadily reconditioning yourself to thrive in calm, flow, and prosperity. Can you imagine the thrill of experiencing life without the constant high of emergency, knowing that abundance is safe, natural, and deserved? And in that moment, the journey shifts from mere awareness to active liberation, because understanding the mechanism of struggle is only the first step toward reclaiming your mind. As the layers of conditioning unravel, you begin to see that the battle was never external. It was a chemical and emotional dance inside you, waiting for you to notice. And once noticed, nothing will ever allow you to return to the old normal, because awareness is a door that only opens one way, forward into freedom. Picture for a moment how strange it feels to realize that chaos, conflict, and constant tension have become your comfort zone, as if the mind has grown dependent on drama to feel alive. Can you sense the subtle pull of familiarity? How even when opportunities for ease appear, there is an invisible tug back toward the storms you've always known? Now consider this: your environment, your routines, even the people around you have been quietly reinforcing this attachment to struggle, like loyal guardians of a life you never consciously chose. You notice how uncertainty feels thrilling, how last-minute crises stir adrenaline and focus, making the mind feel purposeful, even when the body is exhausted and the spirit drained. And yet, as awareness deepens, you start to see the irony. The very situations that make you feel alive are also the ones that keep you trapped in cycles of scarcity and limitation. Picture how your thoughts, emotions, and reactions have been synchronized with this invisible rhythm of struggle, almost like dancing to a song you never wrote but cannot stop hearing. Can you imagine the liberation of stepping off that dance floor, choosing instead a melody of calm, creativity, and deliberate ease that nourishes rather than drains? You begin to notice subtle cues, moments when the mind hesitates to embrace opportunity, when fear quietly whispers that comfort is unnatural or undeserved. And as you observe these cues, a strange sense of power emerges, because seeing the pattern gives you the ability to disrupt it consciously. Now consider this: what you once called survival instincts were actually repetitive loops reinforcing limitation, conditioning you to expect crisis as a permanent state. You sense the weight lifting when you start to imagine life differently, when you picture abundance, stability, and effortless flow as not just possible, but natural. And yet, even with these insights, old habits whisper, testing your resolve, nudging you toward familiar drama and tension, because the mind resists rewriting decades of conditioning. Picture the thrill in recognizing these invisible battles, the satisfaction of observing rather than reacting, the subtle joy in claiming space outside the storms. Can you imagine how empowering it feels to realize that struggle was never required for growth, that tension was never the price of success, and that freedom lies in choosing a different path? And as these realizations settle, you begin to experiment with new rhythms, new responses, and new assumptions that support ease and abundance rather than conflict and scarcity. You notice the first signs of transformation: clearer thinking, calmer emotions, and opportunities that seem to align naturally when the mind is no longer fighting its own patterns. And in that quiet space, a profound understanding emerges. Comfort is not weakness, ease is not betrayal, and stability is not a luxury, but a natural state waiting for your embrace. As the layers peel back, you start to sense a life beyond the cycle, a life that responds to your inner state rather than the storms you once depended on. And with that awareness, the journey intensifies, because seeing the old chains is one thing, but stepping fully into freedom is where the real adventure begins. Now consider this. The stories you've been telling yourself about scarcity are not just mental habits. They are invisible scripts running beneath every conversation, every decision, and every expectation, quietly shaping your reality in ways you barely notice. Picture for a moment how often you repeat phrases like, "I can't afford that," "things are never enough," or "this is just how life is," unaware that each repetition reinforces the poverty state like a spell cast into your subconscious. Can you imagine how differently life would respond if those words were replaced with phrases of possibility, ease, and abundance, spoken with conviction and belief? You start to see that language is not neutral. It is a tool, a sculptor shaping the contours of your experience and either tightening the old chains or carving out space for freedom. And as this awareness grows, you notice patterns in those around you, friends and family, who unknowingly echo the same limitations, reinforcing struggle as if it were sacred. Picture the liberation in realizing that you are not required to participate in these scripts, that you can speak differently, think differently, and in doing so, create a different internal landscape. Now consider this. Every assumption about lack you've held is like a locked door, and every new word, thought, or belief is a key that begins to turn the lock. You begin experimenting, slowly at first, feeling the tension between old habits and new possibilities, noticing the subtle resistance in your own mind when abundance feels too foreign or too bold. And yet, with each successful experiment, confidence grows, curiosity expands, and the mind gradually acclimates to a reality where scarcity is no longer the default. Can you sense how exhilarating it feels to realize that this reprogramming is entirely within your control? That the poverty state is not imposed from outside but self-perpetuated from within? You notice shifts in perception. Opportunities that once seemed invisible now appear with clarity, synchronicities emerge, and the energy around you feels lighter, more responsive, and aligned with possibility. Picture how differently your day unfolds when you speak, think, and act from this new internal script, when expectation aligns with creation rather than limitation. And as this transformation progresses, you begin to see the subtle ways the old narratives attempt to reassert themselves, testing your commitment and resolve. Now consider this. The mind's resistance is not your enemy, but a signal, a guide highlighting areas that still require conscious rewiring and attention. Can you imagine the power in observing this resistance without fear, without judgment, allowing it to inform you rather than control you? And as you maintain this awareness, you start to notice the freedom that comes from reclaiming your internal dialogue, the subtle yet profound shift that begins to ripple into every area of life. Picture the thrill in recognizing that each thought, each phrase, each assumption is a lever you can use to elevate yourself from struggle into ease. And with this understanding, the journey deepens, because language, once unconscious, becomes a deliberate instrument in rewriting the poverty state and stepping fully into abundance. Can you imagine the hidden rewards that struggle has been offering all along? The subtle emotional payoffs that kept you hooked without your awareness, like secret prizes hidden inside hardship itself? Picture for a moment how sympathy, attention, and even a sense of moral superiority have quietly reinforced your attachment to suffering, making each challenge feel meaningful rather than limiting. Now consider this. Every time life seemed unbearable, there was an unconscious satisfaction in proving your resilience, in demonstrating that you could endure what others might collapse under. And this very sense of validation made struggle feel almost necessary. You notice how your relationships sometimes revolve around shared hardship, how bonds are formed through mutual struggle, and how letting go of difficulty can feel like abandoning those invisible contracts. Can you feel the paradox? The very habits that keep you trapped in scarcity also provide hidden emotional rewards, making the cycle seductive and difficult to break. And yet, awareness brings a flicker of clarity. These rewards are fleeting, conditional, and ultimately small compared to the freedom waiting beyond the poverty state. Picture how life might expand if you no longer relied on hardship for emotional stimulation, if joy, peace, and creativity became your primary sources of fulfillment instead. Now consider this. Breaking free requires noticing the invisible gratifications you've been chasing, confronting them, and choosing a higher, more sustainable source of satisfaction. You begin to observe moments when you unconsciously manufacture drama, when crises are amplified, or when opportunities for ease are quietly resisted, all in service of maintaining the subtle payoffs of struggle. And as this recognition deepens, the mind starts to see that the emotional addiction is separate from actual necessity, that it is a habit masquerading as survival instinct. Can you imagine the liberation in disentangling these hidden rewards from your sense of identity, realizing that your worth is not measured by suffering endured, but by the life consciously created? You start experimenting with new forms of emotional reinforcement, gratitude, accomplishment, deliberate joy, discovering that these can be far richer and more sustainable than the fleeting highs of crisis. Picture the thrill in noticing how the world responds differently when your energy is directed toward creation rather than tension, toward possibility rather than drama. And yet, even as you embrace these changes, the old pattern will test you, presenting subtle temptations to return to the familiar, comfortable storm. Now consider this. The key is not denying struggle, but understanding its allure, separating necessity from addiction, and choosing deliberately which emotional currents to follow. You notice that every small act of choosing ease over chaos strengthens your capacity to inhabit abundance, building confidence, clarity, and momentum. Can you feel how empowering it is to realize that the emotional comfort of struggle was never truly rewarding, but a chain you can now unlock? And as this understanding takes hold, the journey deepens, because freedom requires not only awareness, but deliberate, consistent action in the direction of life without compromise. Picture stepping fully into this new rhythm, where joy, creativity, and stability are your default states, and the old cycles of struggle are observed but no longer followed. And in that moment, the subtle intoxication of hardship begins to fade, replaced by a steady, undeniable thrill of possibility and freedom that the mind can finally recognize as real. Now consider this. The fear of abundance is often far greater than the fear of lack, because stepping into prosperity challenges every story you've been told about who you are, what you deserve, and how life is supposed to unfold. Picture for a moment how terrifying it can feel to imagine a life without constant tension, a life where opportunities flow freely, and the safety of struggle is no longer your anchor. Can you sense the subtle resistance that surfaces when you visualize ease, when your mind whispers that comfort is unnatural, that wealth is risky, or that you might lose something essential by letting go of hardship? You notice how old beliefs, inherited and learned, create a shadow over every choice, convincing you that abundance carries hidden dangers, responsibilities, or moral compromises. And yet, even in the midst of fear, there is a quiet spark of curiosity, a flicker that whispers there might be another way, one that does not require constant sacrifice. Picture how this inner conflict feels like standing on the edge of a cliff, torn between the thrill of soaring and the familiarity of solid, yet limiting ground. Now consider this. The fear is not real. It is a projection of habit, a protective mechanism wired over decades to keep you within the comfort of the known struggle. You begin to notice how resistance manifests in subtle ways: hesitation, procrastination, doubt, even distraction. Each a reminder that the mind prefers the familiar storm to the unknown calm. Can you imagine the liberation that comes when you recognize this fear for what it truly is, an echo of conditioning rather than a barrier imposed by the world? You feel a growing courage, a willingness to test new assumptions, to allow yourself to step into opportunities, to embrace abundance without guilt or hesitation. Picture the first small victories, when you act despite fear, when the mind is challenged to accept a reality it previously deemed impossible, and when each success strengthens your capacity to imagine even more. And as these moments accumulate, you start to realize that abundance is not only safe but natural, that the resistance is simply the final hurdle between the old story and your new reality. Now consider this. The very act of choosing abundance rewires your subconscious, creating new pathways for thought, belief, and expectation, reshaping your internal landscape in ways that ripple outward into every area of life. Can you sense how empowering it is to reclaim control, to consciously decide that struggle will no longer define you, and that prosperity is your birthright? You notice how the world begins to respond to this internal shift, presenting opportunities that once seemed invisible or unattainable, aligning with the new rhythm you are cultivating. Picture stepping fully into this new identity, where ease, creativity, and flow become habitual, and where fear no longer dictates your choices or limits your vision. And yet, even as the mind begins to acclimate, subtle doubts will surface, testing commitment and resolve, reminding you of the old comfort of struggle. But as awareness strengthens, you understand that fear is simply a signal, a reminder that transformation is underway and that courage is required to cross fully into freedom. Can you imagine the exhilaration of embracing life without restraint, stepping into abundance with confidence, and allowing ease to become your natural state? And in that moment, the journey intensifies, because seeing the fear is only part of the battle. The real power lies in choosing abundance in spite of it, repeatedly, until it becomes the new norm. Picture for a moment how self-sabotage has quietly woven itself into every opportunity that comes your way, like an invisible hand nudging you back into familiar patterns of limitation just when success is within reach. Can you imagine how many times you've unconsciously pushed away what you truly desired, convincing yourself it wasn't possible, deserved, or safe, even as the universe opened doors for you? Now consider this. Self-sabotage is rarely deliberate. It is the subconscious protecting the mind from the unfamiliar calm and the untested abundance that feels risky because it's unknown. You notice how hesitation, procrastination, distraction, and doubt often arrive just when progress is near. Subtle reminders that your identity is still tied to struggle. And yet, awareness illuminates the hidden mechanics. Every act of resistance is a whisper from the old programming, signaling areas where transformation is still required. Picture the liberation in observing these patterns without judgment, realizing that the mind is not your enemy, but a guide highlighting old habits that no longer serve you. Can you sense the thrill of stepping into action despite doubt, of moving forward even when the familiar chaos feels safer than ease, and of proving to yourself that creation can occur without struggle? You notice the subtle ways self-sabotage appears in relationships, finances, and career, showing that the poverty state is not just about money, but about internalized patterns of limitation. And as you track these behaviors, a powerful realization emerges. Each small act of conscious choice, each deliberate step toward abundance, chips away at the old programming. Now consider this. Every victory, no matter how tiny, strengthens your identity as someone who creates rather than survives, someone who responds rather than reacts, someone who thrives rather than merely endures. Picture the exhilaration of reclaiming control, noticing how opportunities once blocked now flow more naturally, and sensing how resistance diminishes as confidence grows. Can you imagine how transformative it feels to step outside the unconscious cycle, to see clearly the ways the mind has been holding you back, and to begin acting differently? You begin to recognize that self-sabotage is a symptom, not the cause, and that true liberation comes from addressing the root, the subconscious beliefs that have quietly dictated your limits. And yet, even with awareness, the old patterns test you repeatedly, presenting challenges designed to measure your commitment to change. Picture yourself responding differently each time, choosing action over hesitation, clarity over doubt, and abundance over limitation. And in this repeated practice, the poverty state begins to lose its grip because each conscious choice rewires the mind, creating new neural pathways that support possibility rather than scarcity. Now the landscape of your life starts to shift, subtle at first, then more pronounced, as freedom becomes a tangible, lived experience rather than an abstract concept. Can you feel the momentum building, the sense of agency growing, and the quiet thrill of knowing that the chains of self-sabotage are breaking, one deliberate step at a time? And as this unfolds, the journey enters a new phase, because awareness alone is no longer enough. The mind must be trained to expect, accept, and embody abundance. Can you imagine how much of your sense of belonging has been tied to struggle? How hardship has quietly bonded you to friends, family, and communities in ways that make leaving it behind feel like betrayal? Picture for a moment how the shared stories of sacrifice, the collective commiseration over challenges, and the unspoken understanding of "we've been through worse" have created invisible ties that pull you back whenever you try to rise above. Now consider this: breaking free from struggle doesn't just mean changing your finances or mindset. It also means redefining your place within the people and systems you've always known. You notice how difficult it can feel to imagine joy, ease, or abundance without fearing judgment, misunderstanding, or even rejection from those who still live by the old scripts. And yet, as awareness deepens, you begin to see that these bonds are not unbreakable. That connection doesn't require shared suffering, and that community can exist around possibility rather than limitation. Picture the subtle courage it takes to step into a life that feels different while maintaining love and respect for those who haven't made the same leap. Can you sense how empowering it is to realize that your freedom doesn't diminish anyone else's? That breaking the cycle allows you to create a ripple of inspiration rather than resentment. You begin to experiment with new forms of connection, conversations centered around possibility, curiosity, and growth, rather than reinforcing old fears and limitations. Now consider this. Every time you act from this new paradigm, you subtly shift the collective consciousness around you, showing others that abundance and ease are possible, safe, and even natural. You notice how energy begins to change in your relationships, how some people naturally gravitate toward this new rhythm, while others resist, reminding you that freedom always comes with discernment. Picture the thrill in recognizing that your choice to embrace abundance and peace can quietly influence and uplift those around you without needing to fight, argue, or justify. Can you imagine a world where your joy doesn't alienate others, but serves as a beacon, illustrating a new way to live beyond struggle? And yet, even with these insights, the mind will test you with nostalgia for hardship, with old emotional comforts, and with the magnetic pull of familiar tension. You notice how the desire for approval, validation, or inclusion can sometimes mask the subtle resistance to change, challenging you to hold firm to your new path. Picture yourself navigating this delicate balance, embracing abundance while honoring the people in your life, creating a harmony between freedom and connection. Now consider this. Each conscious step away from shared struggle strengthens your internal authority, solidifies your identity, and redefines the rules of belonging on your terms. You sense a new confidence emerging, a reassurance that you can maintain love, empathy, and respect while no longer subscribing to limitation. And in that understanding, the journey deepens, because you realize that the freedom you seek is not just financial or mental. It is social, emotional, and relational, requiring courage to embody a life beyond the collective struggle. Picture for a moment how culture itself has glorified struggle, how books, films, songs, and even social narratives celebrate hardship as noble, necessary, or virtuous, subtly teaching generations to wear struggle as a badge of honor. Can you imagine how deeply this messaging seeps into your subconscious, shaping your beliefs about what it means to live a real life, to achieve anything meaningful, or to deserve respect and recognition? Now consider this. Every heroic tale, every story of someone making it despite impossible odds, reinforces the idea that success must come at the cost of pain, sacrifice, and relentless effort. You notice how these narratives quietly instruct the mind to equate struggle with identity, to equate hardship with authenticity, and to dismiss ease as unearned, suspicious, or even morally suspect. And yet, awareness opens a window. You begin to see that these cultural scripts are not laws but stories, carefully curated illusions that can be questioned, rewritten, or ignored entirely. Picture the liberation in recognizing that you do not need to suffer to be worthy, that your value is inherent, and that your achievements do not require a soundtrack of misery. Can you sense the subtle rebellion that arises as you test these beliefs? Imagining life and success without the accompanying drama, without the glorified grind, and without the badge of suffering, you begin to notice the pressure that culture exerts, how norms, expectations, and comparisons subtly maintain the poverty state by convincing you that ease is abnormal or lazy. Now consider this. By stepping outside these narratives, you are not rejecting society, but reclaiming your personal story, choosing to define success, fulfillment, and prosperity on your terms. You see how movies glorifying the struggle hero, how songs celebrating hardship, and how communal stories of endurance all reinforce patterns you've unconsciously adopted. Picture the thrill in realizing that the patterns can be unlearned, that the applause for suffering is optional, and that cultural scripts are malleable when your awareness rises. Can you imagine the power in consciously rejecting the glorification of struggle, in refusing to let drama dictate your self-worth, and in creating a new narrative centered on ease, creativity, and abundance? And yet, even as you embrace this freedom, remnants of old conditioning will surface, testing your resolve and tempting you to conform to familiar narratives. You notice how subtle cues, a song, a story, a conversation, can reignite old beliefs, challenging you to maintain your new perspective. Picture yourself holding firm, choosing inspiration over imitation, creativity over conformity, and freedom over prescribed struggle. Now consider this: cultural glorification of hardship is not your enemy, but a mirror, revealing how deeply you have internalized stories that no longer serve your highest vision. And in this recognition, you step further into autonomy, discovering that life can be meaningful, vibrant, and expansive without the constant accompaniment of struggle. Can you feel the exhilaration of realizing that culture may narrate one story, but you have the power to live another entirely, one that celebrates abundance, peace, and possibility as much as courage and resilience? And with that, the journey intensifies, because the mind now sees not only the personal, but the collective chains, offering an opportunity to rise above both. Now consider this: constant struggle doesn't just shape your behavior, it reshapes your imagination, narrowing the possibilities you allow yourself to see and creating invisible ceilings around what you believe you can achieve. Picture for a moment how survival-focused thinking compresses creativity, forcing the mind to prioritize immediate problems over visionary ideas, long-term goals, or bold experiments. Can you imagine the subtle ways this limitation manifests, from hesitating to dream big, to doubting your capacity, to avoiding opportunities that feel too risky or too good to be true? You notice how the brain, trained for scarcity, automatically scans for obstacles rather than openings, spotting problems before possibilities, reinforcing a mindset of limitation even when abundance is present. And yet, awareness allows a crack to form, revealing that these mental constraints are learned, habitual, and entirely reversible if you consciously cultivate a richer internal landscape. Picture the exhilaration of imagining without restriction, allowing your mind to wander freely into visions of prosperity, influence, and impact, unshackled by fear or habit. Now consider this: every small expansion of thought, every daring assumption that you can thrive, begins to ripple outward, influencing decisions, actions, and circumstances in tangible ways. Can you feel how empowering it is to recognize that limitation exists only in the boundaries you've accepted, and that removing them is not just possible, but essential for transformation? You begin to notice subtle signs of imagination atrophying under struggle: hesitation, overanalysis, self-doubt, and even physical tension that mirrors mental constriction. And as you experiment with new ways of thinking, visualizing, and assuming abundance, the mind gradually recalibrates, learning that vast possibilities are not threatening but natural. Picture the thrill of breaking free from old mental patterns, of entertaining bold visions that once felt impossible, and sensing the energy shift within you as your internal world expands. Now consider this: The poverty state is reinforced not only by external lack, but by the inner limitation of imagination, which acts as a silent gatekeeper for what you allow into your life. Can you imagine the liberation in realizing that expanding your inner world directly expands your external world? That dreaming vividly is not frivolous but foundational to creation? You notice the subtle joy in exploring ideas without judgment, in assuming outcomes that delight and excite, and in trusting that your imagination is a reliable guide toward abundance. And yet, old constraints will attempt to pull you back, whispering that big dreams are dangerous, unrealistic, or undeserved. Picture yourself stepping past these whispers, choosing vision over caution, curiosity over fear, and creation over limitation. Now consider this. Every act of mental expansion chips away at the invisible walls of the poverty state, allowing opportunities to flow that were previously unseen or inaccessible. Can you feel the exhilaration of knowing that your imagination is a powerful engine, capable of reshaping your life in alignment with the abundance you choose to assume? And in this realization, the journey deepens, because imagination is no longer optional. It is the key to breaking free from limitation entirely. Picture for a moment the subtle ways identity has been entangled with struggle, how the stories you tell yourself about who you are inseparable from the hardships you've endured, making ease feel foreign or even wrong. Can you imagine how many decisions, actions, and sacrifices have been filtered through the lens of proving your resilience rather than embracing possibility? Now consider this. The mind resists redefinition, because letting go of struggle feels like erasing a part of yourself, even if that part has caused pain for years. You notice how deeply survival patterns are intertwined with self-concept, how accomplishments, failures, and even daily routines have been unconsciously chosen to reinforce a narrative of limitation. And yet awareness sparks a subtle rebellion, a curiosity that whispers you might be more than the sum of your hardships, that identity can evolve as easily as thought. Picture the thrill of experimenting with a new self-image, imagining a version of you that navigates life with confidence, ease, and abundance, free from the habitual patterns of struggle. Can you sense how exhilarating and terrifying this duality is? As old self-concepts tug at your energy while new possibilities beckon, you begin to notice moments when your behavior clashes with your desired identity. Subtle hesitations or self-doubt signaling that the old programming is still active. Now consider this. Each conscious choice to act from a new, empowered identity gradually weakens the grip of the poverty state, rewriting the internal script that has long dictated your limitations. You see how belief, emotion, and action are inseparably linked. How imagining a new self is only effective when reinforced by deliberate, consistent behaviors aligned with abundance. Picture the empowerment in observing your old identity without judgment, understanding it as a tool once necessary for survival but no longer required for growth. Can you imagine the liberation that comes when your sense of worth is no longer tied to struggle, sacrifice, or drama, but to your capacity to create, expand, and thrive? And as you step into this evolving identity, you notice opportunities, resources, and ideas flowing in ways that once felt impossible, confirming the alignment of self with circumstance. Now consider this. Identity is not fixed, and the more you assume the energy, thought patterns, and behaviors of abundance, the more reality adjusts to match. You begin to see the subtle signs of transformation, the internal shifts in perception, the external synchronicities, and the growing confidence in navigating life differently. Picture the joy in claiming a new narrative, one that celebrates possibility, freedom, and creativity as intrinsic rather than earned. Can you feel how this reclamation of self becomes a cornerstone for breaking the cycle of struggle, a foundation upon which abundance naturally builds? And in this realization, the journey intensifies, because identity is no longer a passive inheritance, but a deliberate creation, shaping every moment of life with intention and power. Now consider this. The habits that once kept you trapped in struggle are not just external actions, they are deeply embedded mental routines, automatic thought loops, and emotional reflexes that maintain the poverty state without your conscious awareness. Picture for a moment how often your mind drifts into worry, doubt, or imagined scarcity, as if rehearsing old dramas that no longer serve you but feel comfortingly familiar. Can you sense how resistance arises the moment you attempt to change? How the brain instinctively reverts to what it knows, even when that known is painful or limiting? You notice how patterns of procrastination, overthinking, and self-criticism subtly reinforce scarcity, creating a feedback loop where fear of lack drives behavior, which in turn produces the very results your mind anticipated. And yet, awareness offers a crack in the armor, revealing that habits are malleable, that neural pathways can be rewired through deliberate attention, repetition, and conscious choice. Picture the thrill of experimenting with new mental routines: gratitude instead of complaint, possibility instead of limitation, clarity instead of panic, and feeling the subtle shift in energy, perception, and opportunity. Now consider this. Every small adjustment compounds, slowly reshaping the subconscious architecture that has dictated your experience for years, allowing abundance to flow more naturally with each iteration. You begin to notice triggers, moments when old habits arise, and learn to respond rather than react, observing patterns without judgment and choosing differently. Can you imagine the liberation in realizing that your brain is a tool, not a master, and that repeated, intentional practice can recalibrate it toward ease, creativity, and prosperity? You see how thoughts and emotions are tightly intertwined, how deliberate mental shifts create new emotional landscapes that reinforce abundance instead of struggle. Picture the subtle joy in catching yourself before defaulting to scarcity, in redirecting attention toward possibility, and in noticing how circumstances begin to align in response. Now consider this. The process is gradual, requiring patience, persistence, and gentle self-discipline, but each step strengthens your internal authority over habitual limitation. Can you feel the excitement as mental flexibility grows, as old patterns lose their grip, and as the mind begins to anticipate ease and opportunity rather than chaos and lack? You notice how daily life feels lighter, how challenges are approached with curiosity rather than fear, and how creativity flows more freely when tension no longer dominates attention. Picture yourself cultivating this rhythm deliberately, practicing new mental habits, and watching the poverty state gradually dissolve into possibility. And as these shifts solidify, the journey deepens, because liberation is no longer theoretical. It is lived, habitual, and embodied in every thought, emotion, and action. Now the adventure becomes sustaining these new patterns, allowing ease, abundance, and freedom to become your default state rather than an occasional exception. Can you sense the power in mastering the internal mechanisms that once controlled you, and the thrill in knowing that the poverty state can no longer dictate your life? And in this mastery, the journey moves toward its next stage, where subtle internal transformation cascades into tangible external results. Picture for a moment the hidden influence of your environment, how every space, object, and interaction subtly reinforces the poverty state, keeping you tethered to struggle even when your mind desires change. Can you imagine how the people you spend time with, the media you consume, and the routines you follow act like invisible currents, steering your thoughts, emotions, and expectations towards scarcity rather than possibility? Now consider this. Breaking free is not just an internal challenge. It requires curating your environment to support the life you want, surrounding yourself with cues, people, and experiences that reinforce abundance and ease. You notice how certain conversations, habits, or physical spaces can subtly drain energy, evoke old fears, or trigger familiar patterns of limitation, reminding you that freedom is always partially a choice of context. And yet, awareness empowers you to make selective changes, to consciously invite stimuli that expand perception, nurture creativity, and reinforce possibility over fear. Picture the exhilaration in redesigning daily routines, choosing companions who elevate rather than drain, and engaging with content that inspires rather than restricts. Can you sense how subtle environmental adjustments create disproportionate effects, shaping thought patterns, emotional responses, and even opportunities in ways previously unnoticed? Now consider this. Abundance is contagious, and aligning your surroundings with the energy of growth, curiosity, and possibility accelerates the rewiring of old scarcity habits. You begin to notice the cues that trigger old loops and consciously replace them with prompts that remind you of your potential, your goals, and your inherent worth. Picture the thrill in experiencing how your environment can become a silent partner in creation, nudging you toward confidence, clarity, and decisive action, rather than fear and hesitation. Can you imagine the freedom in realizing that you are not a passive recipient of circumstance, but an architect of both internal and external realities? And yet, even with deliberate adjustments, old environments and influences will test your resolve, reminding you that transformation requires vigilance, discernment, and consistency. You notice how small changes, replacing draining routines, limiting interactions, or curating media, begin to amplify energy, focus, and creativity, gradually tipping the balance toward abundance. Picture the empowerment in knowing that you can construct an external ecosystem that mirrors and reinforces the internal state you are cultivating. Now consider this. Every choice to optimize environment, relationships, and habits compounds, accelerating your alignment with a life of ease, flow, and opportunity. Can you feel the thrill as synchronicities increase, obstacles feel lighter, and momentum builds naturally when environment and mind are harmonized? You notice how your perception of possibilities expands as old triggers lose their power, and how each deliberate adjustment strengthens your identity as someone capable of thriving. Picture the satisfaction in knowing that freedom is not abstract, but tangible, sculpted by the conscious orchestration of both inner and outer worlds. And as these shifts settle into rhythm, the journey deepens, because the interplay between environment and mindset becomes a force multiplier, unlocking levels of abundance previously unimaginable. Now consider this. The way you define success has been subtly shaped by struggle, as if achievement only counts when it comes drenched in hardship, sacrifice, and relentless effort. Picture for a moment how many goals you've unconsciously rejected, how many dreams you've scaled back, simply because they didn't fit the familiar template of difficulty, pressure, or deprivation. Can you imagine how liberating it would feel to redefine success on your own terms, to measure it by fulfillment, creativity, and flow, rather than exhaustion and scarcity? You notice how the mind clings to the belief that ease equals laziness, that comfort diminishes value, and that anything gained without struggle is unearned. And yet, awareness begins to crack this illusion, revealing that meaningful achievement can coexist with abundance, peace, and joy. Picture the thrill in embracing goals that excite rather than drain, projects that inspire rather than overwhelm, and results that align with your highest vision instead of habitually reinforcing limitation. Can you sense how empowering it is to consciously choose definitions of success that honor your potential, your time, and your energy? Now consider this. Every time you act from this new definition, you subtly rewrite the rules of your life, dismantling the narrative that struggle is necessary for recognition, validation, or accomplishment. You begin to notice how old measures of success, overwork, self-denial, constant comparison, lose their grip, and how new metrics centered on growth, creativity, and impact take their place. Picture the joy in celebrating progress, big or small, without the need for struggle to validate it, and sensing how this shift reshapes both internal satisfaction and external results. Can you imagine the confidence that emerges when your achievements reflect your vision rather than external expectations or habitual limitation? You notice how energy, focus, and clarity improve when you act from purpose rather than compulsion, and how obstacles feel less threatening when you operate from alignment rather than fear. Now consider this. The very act of redefining success recalibrates the mind's expectations, creating a fertile ground where opportunity and abundance naturally flourish. Picture the subtle yet profound ripple effects, where self-assured choices inspire others, attract aligned collaborators, and magnify the impact of your actions. Can you feel the thrill of stepping into a reality where effort is measured, not by struggle endured, but by intention, strategy, and joy in creation? And as this perspective strengthens, you begin to notice that abundance, fulfillment, and ease are not external luxuries. They are integral markers of genuine success. Picture yourself fully inhabiting this new definition, acting decisively, and moving through life with the confidence that every choice reinforces your vision rather than your fears. And in that realization, the journey intensifies, because the freedom to define success is also the freedom to live a life unbound by old scarcity narratives. Can you imagine the moment when you realize that the poverty state isn't a reflection of circumstance, talent, or effort, but a self-reinforcing mindset that can be unlearned, rewired, and replaced? Picture for a moment how liberating it feels to see that every struggle, every obstacle, and every limitation you've faced has been a lesson in disguise, guiding you toward awareness rather than condemning you to life under scarcity. Now consider this. Breaking free requires more than desire. It requires consistent observation, deliberate action, and the courage to challenge every assumption that once seemed absolute. You notice how subtle patterns of thinking, speaking, and behaving have dictated outcomes for years, creating an invisible script that made limitation appear inevitable. And yet, with each conscious choice to act differently, to think differently, and to assume abundance, the grip of the old programming weakens. Picture the thrill in noticing small shifts, how challenges now feel like opportunities, how fear is met with curiosity, and how ease begins to feel natural rather than threatening. Can you sense the exhilaration in reclaiming authority over your internal state, knowing that no external circumstance can dictate your experience unless you allow it? Now consider this. The poverty state is seductive because it is familiar, but familiarity is not safety. It is habit, masquerading as necessity, and recognizing this is the first step to liberation. You begin to observe how quickly old patterns try to reassert themselves, how subtle doubts or distractions attempt to pull you back, and how the mind clings to what it knows even when it no longer serves you. Picture the empowerment in responding consciously, choosing alignment over habit, creativity over fear, and freedom over limitation, proving to yourself that a different reality is not only possible, but inevitable when intentionally cultivated. Can you imagine the energy that emerges as resistance fades, as self-sabotage diminishes, and as clarity and momentum flow unimpeded? You notice the subtle synchronicities, the doors opening seemingly out of nowhere, the ease with which ideas, people, and resources align with your new state of mind. And yet, the journey is not a straight path. Challenges will still arise, but they are now measured by insight rather than fear, by curiosity rather than desperation. Picture the satisfaction in recognizing that each conscious choice strengthens the neural pathways of abundance, reinforcing the belief that prosperity, peace, and creativity are your natural states. Now consider this. Freedom is cultivated through repetition, intention, and awareness, until living in alignment with possibility becomes habitual, automatic, and effortless. Can you feel the thrill in witnessing your own transformation, as old chains fall away and the mind begins to expect success, ease, and joy as default conditions? And as this shift consolidates, you begin to see life itself as responsive, malleable, and cooperative, revealing that the struggle was never necessary. It was habitual, and now optional. Picture stepping fully into this new paradigm, where internal authority, imagination, and deliberate creation guide every moment, and the poverty state no longer holds power over your experience. And in that realization, the journey reaches its crescendo, because the mind now knows the truth. Abundance is not a reward, struggle is not essential, and freedom is always available to those who claim it. Picture for a moment the profound freedom that arises when the poverty state finally releases its grip, when struggle is no longer your compass and abundance becomes your natural orientation. Can you imagine how different life feels when every thought, every word, and every action is aligned with possibility, creativity, and flow, rather than fear, limitation, and tension? Now consider this. The journey through struggle was never a punishment, but a teacher, a series of lessons designed to reveal the patterns, beliefs, and habits that once kept you confined, so you could consciously choose a new reality. You notice how awareness, consistent practice, and deliberate mental rewiring have reshaped your internal world, creating a fertile ground where opportunities, resources, and synchronicities respond effortlessly to your state. And yet, even in liberation, humility and vigilance remain your allies. Because freedom is a practice, not a one-time achievement, requiring continued attention to thought, emotion, and environment. Picture the thrill of acting from a place of inner authority, where decisions are guided by alignment, intuition, and possibility, rather than habit, fear, or external pressure. Can you feel the exhilaration as you witness old limitations fade, as self-sabotage diminishes, and as confidence in your creative power solidifies into a daily experience. Now consider this. The mind, once addicted to struggle, is now trained to anticipate abundance, to expect ease, and to navigate challenges with clarity and composure, transforming obstacles into opportunities for growth. You notice how relationships, career, finances, and personal fulfillment begin to reflect this internal shift, responding to the energy of abundance rather than the patterns of scarcity. Picture the joy of moving through life without the need for constant validation through hardship, without the invisible chains of struggle dictating your pace, choices, or sense of worth. Can you imagine the quiet thrill of mastery, where each day reinforces the belief that life is cooperative, resources are abundant, and creation is natural? You see how your imagination, focus, and deliberate assumptions now shape reality directly, with internal alignment producing external results that once seemed improbable. Now consider this. Every challenge encountered becomes a tool for refinement rather than a trap, a way to strengthen your capacity for conscious creation rather than a confirmation of limitation. You feel the subtle satisfaction in witnessing how old narratives lose their influence, how cultural glorification of struggle no longer dictates your choices, and how your identity thrives independent of inherited scripts. Picture yourself fully inhabiting a life where joy, ease, and abundance are expected, where mental clarity and deliberate thought guide action, and where freedom is embodied in every decision. Can you sense the expansive energy, the flow of possibility, and the resilience that emerges when struggle is no longer a master but a lesson integrated and transcended? And in that realization, you understand a profound truth. The poverty state was never fixed. Struggle was never essential, and the only true limitation was the belief that it was. Picture a life lived deliberately, creatively, and abundantly, where every moment is an opportunity to choose ease, joy, and growth, and where the cycle of struggle has been broken once and for all. And with that understanding, the journey reaches its full expression, because you now stand free, fully aligned, and empowered to live a life defined not by scarcity, but by limitless possibility.